This video is brought to you by my supporters on Patreon. Hi guys, I'm here with a video showing you how I made the armor pieces, well specifically the leg and arm armor for my Nia cosplay. And getting right to it, I traced the pattern for the base of the armor and cut it out in 6mm EVA foam. I do have these patterns and templates for her entire costume up on my store Envy and Etsy, by the way. But moving on, once all those pieces were cut out, I went ahead and took my Dremel and used that to sand around the edges of all of the pieces to make sure that was nice and smooth. And then I moved on to cutting out some edging details, or details that go around the edges, in 2mm EVA foam. And then I also sanded down those edges to make sure they were all nice and smooth before moving on to gluing things together. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. You'll see this in a teeny bit. So at this point in the video, I had already glued the leg pieces shut, which means like I glued them so now they're just a giant cylinder shaped piece. And to help this like sit easier and keep it shape a little bit better, I used a heat gun to round out the EVA foam. But here in this clip, I'm using contact cement to glue the edging details, those 2mm EVA foam pieces, into place. Once the details around the edges were glued into place, I then glued on this weird triangular piece at the top of the leg piece. I used a heat gun to help round out the arm pieces before gluing the pieces together and then gluing on the details. I held the two pieces of the arm pieces together and then marked with a Sharpie a line across it, so I knew exactly where I wanted each piece to sit in a way that would make sure that it's like even on both pieces, because it does have a little excess towards the back. Excess foam, that is. You can totally cut this away later, however I didn't find it to be much of an issue and just left it there. And then I glue on the 2mm EVA foam details, and all of the glue that I'm using in this video is always going to be contact cement until later on when I'll use hot glue, but again, getting ahead of myself, you'll see that later. If your foam is like mine and textured on one side, you could totally sand that down, or you could also purchase foam that isn't textured on either side, which I will have a link to down below. I didn't find it to be that big of an issue though, so I just kind of left it because I knew you wouldn't really see this part of the arm armor quite as much as you do the other ones, so I didn't think it would, I didn't think it was a big deal. I was like, whatever, it's fine. the last thing to do in regards to building the base of like these pieces was to glue together these weird crown looking details that are at the top of her leg and arm armor. And I used 2mm EVA foam to make all of these pieces. It's basically a bunch of triangle or triangular shaped pieces all glued together, but glued at angles so that it has some dimension to it. So there's a top and bottom half to both of these pieces, so I glued together the entire strip of both the top halves together and then both the bottom halves together, and then I glued the bottom and top halves to one another. And I apologize if you can hear any birds in the background. It is the early morning and they love to be very loud now. Use a Dremel to sand down all of the seam lines, make sure those are nice and smooth, as well as the edges. I used a marker to outline the general area where I wanted these to be placed to make sure that they were centered, and then glued those down. Next, I primed all of the pieces with about 5 layers of wood glue mixed with a teeny bit of water. And next I moved on to painting. I used acrylic paints to paint the entire thing. However, even though I haven't yet, I do go back and add a white paint primer as a base, like a white spray paint primer, because I found the gold was taking quite a bit of work and quite a few layers to show up on that green specifically, and it needed to be covered in one solid color to get the colors to show up better. So I do sand away this paint and, you know, re-prep it and prime it, and then spray paint it with a base coat of white, and then go back in and paint it again. So just as a heads up, paint the base on before you do anything. You will most likely want a paint base. You usually do. It's gonna make your paint job stick better. Anyways, after your paint is all, like your painting is all done, top it off with a clear coat of glossy spray paint. Now it was time to make the belt detailing on her armor, and to do this I used some fake white leather looking materials. It's like upholstery vinyl or something like that. That's the fabric that I used for this. I drew a pattern, traced it onto the backside. With this I could actually like trace around it with a pen because it does not show through, which made it a lot easier when adding in some seam allowance and cutting out these pieces. Fold over the raw edges and sew those down using a straight stitch on a sewing machine. Next, I needed to add in the red stitch detailing that her belts, or whatever you want to call these, on her armor had, and to do that I used a ruler to mark out the stitch length on the back side. I'm pretty sure I measured about 1.5 inches for the stitch length, so every ½ inch I made a little dot to mark that that's where the needle's going to be going through the fabric at, and I just used a pen to do this because again it does not show through the fabric. And I used embroidery floss to stitch in the detailing. It's like a really thick embroidery thread. I'm pretty sure it's what people usually do to do like embroidery work on pillows and such. Hand embroidery work at least. Once I was finished marking all of the stitches, I started sewing, and I should note that for the smaller pieces, like on the arm piece, so those really tiny belts in the background over there, the stitch length was obviously not ½ inch, it was much smaller than that. I think it was about 1/4 inch in length instead. However, just kind of like do some test dots to figure out what stitch length is going to look best on the back side of the fabric, obviously, and then keep that going from there using a ruler. I use a little bit of hot glue to secure the thread into place, just to make sure that nothing was going to come undone. However, this isn't super important because you are just going to glue down this whole thing later anyways. I just found myself needing to cut off a little bit of excess because I made the belts a teeny bit too long, but that's totally fine because it's way easier to take away extra than add extra in. I'm sorry if you can hear that dog barking too. Everything's just like early in the morning apparently. Anyways, the next thing I do is use hot glue to glue this down onto the armor. And because her armor had these two little triangles that the belts come out from underneath, like coming off of the edges, as you see there, I used a heat gun to peel that back up. I avoided gluing it down earlier as well to make sure that this would be easy, and then I glued it down later and used a heat gun to help press that back down into place. Basically, it's supposed to look like the belts are coming out from like under the edge detailing of her armor. However, I didn't want to glue them into place first and then have to paint around them. It's so much easier to do it this way, which is why I did it this way. As you can see here, once again, the belts were a little bit too long because I forgot to cut off the edging detail for the template. For when I was cutting out the belt template, I kept it the same length all the way to the edge of the armor rather than to where the detail begins, which again is not that big of a deal. I just cut off the excess. I also pinned this into place just so that I could make sure everything was sitting evenly and slide the belts that sit under this top belt into place as well and make sure those were even on both sides. So if you have little clips or little pins that you can stick things into place, definitely use those to your advantage to make sure everything's staying where it should be. The last thing to do was add in some final detail stitches that she has on the armor itself at the front and back, and I used white embroidery floss to do this and made the stitches about 1 inch in length. And that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and check out my other videos. There will be a couple more Nia ones, at least one more, so hopefully you guys stick around to see that. Have a lovely day. I hope you found this helpful, and bye!